what we're going to do for this session and is I've got some experts and I've got some, I don't want to call them fill-in experts because they're really great, but we invited some folks, and some of those folks either had to make plane reservations or there were some issues. And what we're going to go ahead and do is basically talk about communicating with government officials, and we're going to do it from the point of perspective of sort of some folks who do it a lot. We have Alan Pizarski here, who speaks with a lot of state DOTs, U.S. DOT, AASHTO, sort of an institution around Washington, on the History Committee, a part of Washington history.
Put in an institution.
Everything. We also have on the end, we have Tom Rubin, who I think most importantly, at least in my mind, actually worked at a transit agency, so has some understanding maybe of what the people at transit agencies actually think and how you can get them to do what you'd like, maybe, if you can. And then I'm going to have our third speaker introduce himself, because I don't know him as well.
He's not Bob Pishue.
He's not Bob Pishue, yeah. We take that name tag down. Go
okay.
ahead. Just quick, like 30
sure.
seconds.
I'm Dick Paler, and I'm the chair of the Eastside Transportation Association in King County, Washington, former city council member from the city of Bothell, been involved in transportation policy for 15 years.
Okay, great. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to have each of them. I'll also give a little brief stuff from the point of a congressional staffer and how you actually talk to your congressman and get stuff done, and who actually gets stuff done. It's not the congressman. And then we'll each take about 5 minutes to sort of give you our perspective on what the organization does. So in other words, what does U.S. DOT do? What does, yeah, honestly, what do they really do? From a political perspective, what is the role of, you in terms of getting policy done, in terms of influencing? I mean, not what the name tag official description is, but what do you really do? And then for Tom Rubin, oh boy, what a transit agency really does. I'm almost afraid to listen. So just starting off, so I worked as a congressional staffer for a representative who was on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in Washington. Now, so you know, in the House, each representative, all 435 of them, has probably a total of 4 folks who do policy. And there's about 20 different policy issues in D.C., everything from firearms to transportation. And actually, transportation with firearms maybe has some potential. I should think about that. But the idea is these folks are generally not experts in any one thing, because they have to split their time between all of these various tasks. They are usually 22 to 25 years old, right out of undergraduate, with a degree in political science maybe, but probably not much knowledge of any of the topics. They're very rushed. They go to meetings. They're learning all the time. And after they're on Capitol Hill for about 3 to 5 years, they're leaving to go to a consulting agency, a lobbying group, someone like that, where they can make more money. Your average starting salary on Capitol Hill in the House is probably now between $28,000 and $32,000. If you've ever spent time in Washington, D.C., you know that means you're living with 3 other people in a very dicey neighborhood in town. In the Senate, things are a little bit better. They usually have maybe 2 or 3 issues. There's more staffers, and it's because basically Senate offices have more money. And by the way, if you didn't know, you, the taxpayers, are paying the salaries for these staffers, so maybe I shouldn't tell you that, but you are. And so they're usually a little bit better experts, a little bit more knowledge, because there's only 100 senators. And so each senator, maybe not every one of them, but has more of sort of an influence on policy, on final bills. When you have 435 folks in the House, a lot of them just, I mean, they don't really care about, transportation or land use or environment or, the issues real estate we're interested in. And even if they do, because of the rules process, I'm sure you all have been familiar with some of the fights over Speaker of the House and, some of the arcane rules of who gets to offer amendments, they don't really have a heck of a lot of power. Now, each body in Congress also has what we would call professional staff. These folks are generally much better educated. They often have 10, maybe more years experience in the outside world. Some come from consulting companies, some have various backgrounds. They are the ones who are actually writing the bills that have to do with transportation. And so because when these folks go and leave after they've written the bill, they know all the nuances of the bill. They're very valuable to whatever consulting firm wants to hire them because they sort of know what's in there and how to get those things done. So these tend to be your higher experts, but these are only your committee staff. In terms of the folks for Congress, and I'll address this in a few minutes later after everyone has spoken, but there is a lot of power in meeting with your your folks, either in the district or in DC, in getting to know your staff and treating them well. Because unless you're best friends with the congressman is not the one answering the phone. He's not the one writing letters to you, well, in most cases. It's really a matter of the staff. And so it's a staff-driven process, and that is, in terms of working with federal agencies, getting things done, influencing the congressman, probably the most important thing. So I'm going to sit down now and let each of the other speakers talk for a few minutes, and then we'll get to questions. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. I guess this is going to be more anecdotal than anything else. I'd love to give you a classification of which you can pigeonhole these people in, but if there is such a classification, I haven't quite worked it out yet. I'm going to talk about a couple of aspects of this. The first one is that my first job was in an MPO, a serious MPO, and this was in the very early days. The Tri-State Transportation Commission, the New York metropolitan area from Connecticut to New Jersey. In those days, the great difference was my boss knew my job a lot better than I did, because this was the early days when we were learning how to do planning, how to do modeling, and your bosses were better at your job than you were. When I came to Washington, I went to work for the Council of Governments, and again, I was working with colleagues, but the director of WashCog had no clue as to what we did. All he knew is that certain people seemed to approve of it, so he let us keep doing it. And so there's a very real distinction, I think, between the levels of capability. I went into the office of the secretary, DOT. My job was to provide statistical policy information to support policy for the secretarial officers. Totally different environment. Instead of guys being a lot better than I was around me, I was supposedly the specialist, and there were 30 or 40 people, each of whom you could have put a sign above their door, urban goods movement, environmental analysis. They were specialists in a thing, and the assistant secretary for policy, the deputy secretary, in effect, would come and slide a question under the door, and guy inside would thrash around, bang around. 2 days later, a memo would come out. And there is that process. Those people, I found, were, to me, immensely impressive. I would get in the limo with my boss, and we'd be going to the Hill to testify. He'd be doing the testifying, and some of you know Washington. With all the lights against you, it's a 15-minute ride to the Congress. And I would brief him in the limo on the way there, and he'd sit down and brief the Congress as if he knew what he was talking about. And when they got to a really hard question, he might turn around and look at me. But the ability to kind of synthesize stuff and put it together in a cogent way, I think, was a great skill. Typically, these guys were lawyers. But they had that ability to put it all together and to lay it out in a way that people could address it and discuss it. In the Congress, I've had, since that time, I spent a lot of time testifying, and very mixed reactions, almost a little different from what you said. I have found whenever I'm interacting in the Senate or the House, much more likely to have a serious conversation in the House than the Senate. The senators are always, they walk in the room, they look around, and there's no TV cameras, they lose interest, and they speak and they head for the door. You do get in the House specialists, particularly in transportation. You get 50, 60 people who are really into transportation, and you can have a serious discussion. Jim Oberstar, who chaired the committee for a long time, was one of the more knowledgeable people in the country about transportation. That didn't mean I agreed with Jim a lot, but that's another story. I have to go back and explain a little bit about the history. My work is, I had tremendous advantage because my job was to be the guy who had the data and understood what was going on, so they'd come to me for that kind of objective sense of what was happening. And so I was not being treated as a kind of an advocate when I sat down with them. But the real issues were always, in September, my boss would come to me and say, they're going to be talking about freight regulation. We need this information, this information. And my answer to him was, give me $6 million in 2 years and I'll have the answer. Guess what? That doesn't work. And he says, can't do it. Next September, the same discussion. After about 2 years, he finally figured out that maybe he ought to let me spend some money. The point is that it's the information that you have at hand at the time when the issue arises that will be used to dispose of whatever that topic is. And so you've got to be prepared for that next issue. You have to focus on down the road, what's coming, where are the national issues going to be, so that you're prepared when that issue arises. I remember selling my boss $10 million worth of program at a time when $10 million was a ton of money, to develop the National Geographic coding systems, which now turned into Google. And I did a great job of explaining what this whole thing was all about, and we were going to address coding so that the census would know where people started and what their destinations for work was and all that stuff. And my boss looked at me, he said, you just described that you have the solution to a problem that I never knew existed. And so you've got to recognize that you're kind of bridging a gulf there, where you're explaining solutions to problems that he didn't even know there was a problem. So I think you need to be able to play with the people and recognize their skills. Sometimes they're simply asking for information, and they'd love to have a great answer, a great response. Other times they're just trying to pass it off and temporize to get onto some other subject. I think the thing I guess I would close with is the notion of timing, of recognizing when the right time is to focus on a particular topic. I think I should stop there. We can get the discussion.
We're going to go a little bit out of order in case I have to leave to catch my flight. Having spent a little time in D.C., I just feel obliged to make a few comments. If you're going to go up and see somebody on the Hill, first of all, find your congressperson. Most of the time, if you try to talk to anybody in Congress, you in my district is the first question. There are some exceptions to that. Obviously, there are committee chairs, ranking members, et cetera, that have key positions, and you may want to talk to them on the technical. But if you're talking about trying to get an ear, start with your congressperson. Call, write, email, fax, whatever. Make an appointment. Go through the website. Find out who the person is who specializes in that. Make an appointment. Call ahead if you can. Make an appointment. Try to fit into that person's schedule. They will appreciate being treated like a professional. Then hope to hell that's who you meet with. One thing we have is a lot of interns, a whole lot of interns. And the last trip, unfortunately, I was there to help some people I worked with who were not real familiar with the process. And I finally figured out this wasn't even a college intern we were working with. It was a high school intern who happened to be the only person in the office who was available to meet with us. And of course, they're going to meet. It's just that the person you're talking with doesn't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. So you really want to try to get somebody who knows something. Working with the committee staff is very good if you can do it. They are very knowledgeable. It may be difficult to get much information from them. Occasionally you can, but at least you can try to impart some things to them. And anybody who has had the experience of going through legislation and seeing what's in it has asked themselves the question or reflected on, boy, it's really too bad there wasn't anybody in the room when this legislation was written that had any idea what this was about. Happens all the time. Do not expect to meet with the congressperson or senator. That is very, very rare unless you are representing a major constituency and or you are a contributor, and a good-sized contributor at that. Now, don't think that this means that you're buying a vote. What you're buying is access. You at least get in the door. And what most of the contributions are, not all, but most of the contributions, the big money, is not to sway people, but to make sure the people that are with you stay with you. An honest politician in Washington is one that once he's bought, stays bought. Okay. So they want to make sure that they have access and that they hear something on the other side, you're going to hear about it, and you have time. So it's quite an interesting thing. Most of the trade associations spend half their time or more on the Hill. And unfortunately, there is not the Little People's Trade Association. This is what you're dealing with. And all of the major players like the American Public Transportation Association, cities, counties, states, whatever, they have the associations, they have their own lobbyists. This is what you're up against. And they have been playing the game a lot longer than you have. One of the more interesting things is when you run into staff at receptions. And trade associations have their conventions. Most of them are located in Washington. They'll have their annual conventions, et cetera. Day on the Hill, what a zoo. Sometimes it's effective, but sometimes it's an absolute waste of time. Then they have the association. They invite everybody from the Hill. And it's almost hilarious to watch some of the people who are there for the first time. And they run into somebody, who are you? And I'm on Congressperson so-and-so staff. And they're, giving that person the story for the next half an hour. Well, what happens is, as the man said, the staffers aren't paid much and the interns are paid less. And so what a lot of the members of Congress do, they have a big bowl in the back office and all the invitations go in the bowl. And so if it's evening and, you're on a tight budget, well, let's see, what do we have? Oh, heck, that's right on my way home. Yeah, they normally do a good spread. Yeah, let's try that. And so, good luck with that. It doesn't hurt, but know what you're dealing with. Okay, getting to transit. How do you talk to transit agencies? Well, the short answer is, why bother? They aren't listening. There's some things you can do. Find out about all the meetings and make the meetings. And then embarrass them at the meetings, which are normally at night, and they come with all the big graphics and displays, by asking how many people got here by transit. And of course, none of the staff ever get there by transit because, one, they're going all over the place to go home. It's late at night, and they got to carry all the damn materials back, so they always drive. Nobody in transit ever takes transit to get anywhere because transit, frankly, is not really good for getting around most places. There are some exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, it's very hard to be in the transit business as a transit professional working for a transit agency and take transit to where you need to go. By the way, the other thing you want to do is all the smart growth proponents, go out and take a picture of their single-family detached estate and carry it around. What you want to try to do, if you're really trying to be effective, is to get around the community outreach department. They are the official communication, just like the press media person is the official liaison to the press. And they are carefully trained to make sure that you are treated nicely and politely and given absolutely no help whatsoever. You want to get around that and get to the actual professionals, be it planners, engineers, schedulers, whatever, that are actually working on what you are interested in. And this takes time, but figure out who they are. If you have a friend who's a member of the American Public Transportation Association, ask them to go through the roster and give you a hand, etc. They are often members of the trade associations, American Planners Association, for example, and go to the meetings. See who you find. Everybody's got a name tag, name and who they're with. Strike up a conversation. Find out what their interests are, and find out what they hate, and agree with that. Because getting people to like what you like is good, but finding somebody where you hate what they hate is much more important. And see what kind of conversation you can get and what you can exchange information from. Every now and often you get into an interesting situation. When I was the Chief Financial Officer of the Southern California Rapid Transit District in the early 90s in LA, we had our rival organization, the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission, and we hated each other's guts. So we were very happy to let everybody know all the stupid things that the Transportation Commission was doing, and everybody at the Transportation Commission was very happy to let everybody know all the stupid things that we were doing. So we reached out trying to kill the other, and we didn't do that, but we did kill transit for quite a while. So think through, try to find the right people, see if anybody's got a friend, have a sharing of interests. See what you might be able to get that way. Most transit agencies have good libraries that are open to the public. Visit them. Many of them have very good research librarians. Ask them questions. My God, a librarian and somebody comes in and wants help finding information. This can be very valuable. One other thing, whenever you are given a piece of paper, no matter what it is, keep it, file it, store it. Believe me, it'll be a lot of fun sometime later when the story has changed significantly and you can say, but back then you said. Now, there's a document that I only have one copy of, but it's going to go on the website. And this is a strategy and tactics for preparation of a NEPA CEQA administrative record. Now, let me translate that. NEPA is National Environmental Protection Act, and CEQA is in California, so I won't spend much time on that, but they're similar. This is where you get the environmental impact statements. And these come out. It has to be exposure. You want to make comments on it in the vain hope that somebody might actually read it and maybe even respond it and change. Well, they'll always respond. It's just that the usual response, it ranges from, thank you for your comments, which are noted for the record, to, yeah, we thought about that, no chance in hell, sucker. If you're waiting until this process starts, you're already 90% through the process and it's too late. You need to get in at the first step before they actually come up with the very limited set of alternatives that they're going public with for the environmental clearance. But there's a process here, and it's explained in the paper. You want to get in early. You want to get good legal counsel to advise you on what to do and how to do it, and you need to get your team together to go after the process. And I think I'll be able to stay for a little while for some questions, but right now I'm done and on. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, again, excuse me. As I said, my name is Dick Paler, and unlike the gentleman on either side of me, I don't have a lot of experience in Congress, speaking to Congress. I've been to, when I was on the City Council, I went to Washington, D.C. twice. I mostly followed other people around, so I'm going to talk about my experience locally with local government officials. The organization that I represent, the Eastside Transportation Association, as I said earlier, is a private entity that tries to bring the more of a business point of view, that, what we think is the real public interest, or the other way to say it is bring some honest and truth to the discussion. So our group is formally about educating the public and advocacy. And one of the earlier speakers, Glenn Morgan, talked about one of the things that you need to do is infiltrate. My little story is how I've infiltrated and found some recent success. And to that end, our organization has a seat at the table with a whole bunch of elected officials, and it was something we got many years ago. The group, trust me, many of them regret that having been done. They tried to throw me off of it one time because they said that a certain non-voting member was having too much influence over this organization. I took it as the highest compliment I could have ever received. So anyway, and again, most of my time there, I feel like I'm the skunk at the picnic, I say things that nobody else will say. I know some of them are thinking about it. I know they'd like to say it, but you know how it is in groupthink situation. They look around waiting for other hands to go up, and if they're not going up, then they just retreat into their shells. So in that group, and again, the problem begins with, in terms of, a rail effort or some bad idea to go raise taxes and spend money on transportation, starts with, almost in every case, as we've heard for a couple of days here, a predetermined outcome by the leaders, who they want what they want. They want rail. They don't care what the data says. They just want rail. In Seattle, one of the Sound Transit board members famously said many years ago, "We will never be a world-class city unless we have light rail." I thought that was an interesting criteria for a world-class city. So anyway, at this body of elected officials, there's about 15 cities represented, 2 city council members from each city. They're all voting members of the organization. Then, of course, there's transit representatives that are at the table. They're non-voting members as well. The state transportation, DOT, et cetera, sitting around the table. So that's the body. And again, as you can imagine, predetermined outcome. So these people come into the room expecting to just follow the herd. They don't really bring a lot of expertise to the table. They don't really spend a lot of time preparing. I often leave the room wondering, why do these people show up at 7:30 in the morning for a meeting when all they are is a bunch of lemmings? So we, with the help of a couple others, elected officials who were like-minded, we got this group to schedule a retreat that we hadn't had for a long time. And the purpose was to, let's relook at what our purpose is, how are we spending our time, are we accomplishing anything, what are our priorities, et cetera. It's the usual stuff. So we went to that, and fortunately, to my surprise, people came into the room with a pretty open mind about that. And maybe it's because they just didn't think about it. But, so we got people to start, thinking like, okay, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the purpose of this group? The usual questions. And that led us down. We started getting people to agree, well, for the most part, problem is traffic congestion. And we need to find ways to improve that. We need to figure out how we can go fund that. We get it into the plans, everything you have to do to get those things accomplished. And then we came around to, this group used to prepare their own plan. 10, 15 years ago, this group did what they should have been doing. They developed what the priorities were for the area that we represented in East King County, and we prioritized that project list, and then we advocated in our state legislature for funding. That was why I was one of a handful of people that got sent to Washington, D.C. to try to go see what we could do there. Not much, but we made an effort. And so then, out of this, we said we need to get back to developing a plan. And at some point, myself and a couple other people said, well, shouldn't we know there's a lot of new technology coming that's going to impact transportation, mainly with vehicles on highways. Shouldn't we know what that is before we start developing our plan? Shouldn't we know what some of the new tools are instead of just advocating for more of the same that we've been doing for all these years? And everybody, said, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And so we formed a committee to start planning that, and we decided to put on a conference that was around advanced technology coming in transportation. And believe it or not, a couple of the committee members of this planning committee who were from the other side were also from the technology industry or had a background. They got real excited about this, and they became champions for this. Personally, I began to call this our own little Trojan horse here. They didn't know that they were being led to the water, is how I thought of it. So we had a conference. John Niles, sitting over here on the right, was one of the two from the Cates group that organized the event. Alan was one of the speakers there. We sold the room out, 250 people. We didn't get the media attention, but we created a real buzz. And then the other thing that really, I think one of the most exciting things was a company called INREX, which is right in our backyard. I don't know, how many people have heard of INREX? Okay, so a few people. They are the world leader in collection of transportation data, real-time data. They're in our own backyard, yet most of the people in this body of elected officials had no idea who they were. They had no idea who they were. And then the CEO was one of the keynote speakers at this event.
Absolutely dazzling.
Yeah, he was remarkable. Brian Mastella is his name. If you ever get a chance, if he's in your town, and if you can get him to speak to your group, I'd highly recommend it. And I tell you, he went up there and he said, look, we're not a policy shop. We collect data. We try to show people how this data can help them make the right decisions, et cetera. And, as Alan said, he was remarkable. But he said, I'm here to tell you, we knew what the traffic congestion was the day before the first light rail line opened in Seattle to the airport, and we tracked it afterwards. It didn't show up on the radar screen, the difference. It made zero impact. And that, again, when you have somebody like that saying it versus somebody like me saying it, you can imagine the difference it makes. So, again, I guess what I've learned here is, as Glenn said, infiltrate, get inside, try to find a way to move the people along with all the data that's on our side, find some people that have credibility. In that particular case, one of the things we did is I said, I don't want my name or the Eastside Transportation Association to be associated with who's organizing this event. I was clearly participating in the committee, but we downplayed that on purpose, because if people thought I was the one who suggested this, then they wouldn't have shown up. So those are some of the things about talking to local government officials that I think I've found some success in that lately. I've had some people approach me, some of these elected officials after the meeting, come up and say, to my surprise, or I thanked them for giving some support to something I said at a meeting, and they'd say, Dick, I agree with you most of the time of what you say. And of course, I was delighted to hear that, but I would say, could you speak up a little bit more, at these meetings? And I think there's more friends in this room than we realize. So anyway, I'll stop right there.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, no, those are great perspectives. And yeah, I guess I do. I was thinking of Alan's comments about how sometimes the people in the House can be more honest in the Senate. That's true. There are 50 people, probably 50 offices in the House that do know what's going on, and there's the other 385 that have absolutely no idea what's going on. So good point, feast or famine there. Okay, so I just want to ask a couple questions, then open up to the audience. The first one is going to be, these are kind of pat questions, but here we go. What is the most effective way? If there's one thing you're going to do, what is the most effective way to influence elected officials? So I will just tell you again from the congressional staffer point of view, and this may seem totally counterintuitive, there is someone's job in the office called the legislative correspondent to read and respond to every letter that is sent. You are more likely to get a response to a handwritten letter than to a typed letter. And the reason is because if it's a typed letter, we could get 7,000 copies from one group that has computer software that's just bombing Capitol Hill. And, you know, we talk to the office in the same state next door, and we know when that happens. Not fooling anyone. If it's a handwritten letter, it's pretty obvious you only sent one. Now, obviously, you have to read, it has to be legible and whatever. If it's one or two people that are sending it, the office is probably not going to do a thing. If they get 30 letters from the same districts, which is sort of the tell your friends and neighbors and all right, they will respond because their number one job in the House and to a lesser extent the Senate is getting reelected. And in the House, they are always running for reelection. One of the biggest losses, I think, in recent memory, surprise losses, was Eric Cantor's. One of the reasons Eric Cantor lost was because his constituent affairs were known to be awful, and people in the district really hated it. And so all that power and all that, you know, prestige he has, and in some people's minds, all that arrogance, went for nothing because he didn't do the simple stuff. I had a boss in Congress who would proudly tell people he was probably the dumbest person in the room, which was actually very refreshing because most people in Congress are sure they're the smartest person in the room even when they're not. So as a result, our office, and all good offices should be, we're very focused on constituent affairs, responding to letters, because one of the number one things in getting elected, even considering philosophy and ideology, is if you feel you know the congressman and you have a relationship with them, you think in your mind, even if it's not true, that they're going to do something for you and help you out. So go down the panel.
I guess maybe my world is a little bit specialized because I'm very frequently talking to them about information, about getting the information they need. Very different situations. So many congressmen and senators and even city council people are so constantly bombarded with advocacy and with advocacy analysis. Just people shooting at each other and trying to cut each other up, that they often get very hungry for something where they think they're getting an objective, let me call it outside view. I happened to have a situation where I was at a dinner sitting next to the chairman of the Transportation Committee of the state of California. And he was weeping on my shoulder about high-speed rail, and where the hell was he going to find someone who could tell him honestly what the thing was about, as opposed to, you know, the guy's coming in with it's the best thing since sliced bread, it's the worst thing since bananas. It was just, I mean, and it was a really plaintive call for help. Similarly, you'll see it in the House. I sit down and testify before Earl Blumenauer, distinguished congressman from Portland, and of course he says, Pizarski, you just want to pave the world, you know, and we just know that we're just going to shoot blanks at each other. But there are occasions when I've been invited to the House Budget Committee, and the House Budget Committee does everything, so they don't know much about transportation. Right. So at that point, they would really love to have somebody who's knowledgeable tell them a little more about what's going on. So I guess what I'm arguing for, Baruch, is to have information that's new, that's fresh, that's anticipating trends and where the future is going, and that helps, in effect, enlighten them. There's a lot of congressmen who are very willing and interested, and I'm using congressmen as a descriptor for public officials, who would really like to have substantive information that they can bring to bear on a topic. And I'd like to think that that's can be a major positive statement. I don't know if it's true.
Well, I will echo that. Form letters are worthless. Form emails are less than worthless. The best way to communicate with your congressman or senator is to participate in that person's campaign from day one. Contribute both financially and as a very active campaign worker. That will get you access. If you can't do that and you're starting anew and you're communicating, if you're doing it by letter, again, customize. Start with anything that you can do that identifies you in the district, or you've heard him speak at this meeting or whatever, something that identifies you and makes it look like it isn't a form letter. Then be very specific. Some years ago, we had a group in Houston that was very opposed to a light rail, and we organized a letter campaign, and we were very, very careful to make sure that each of you picks a different building that will be destroyed and writes about that building. Short letter, but it focused on that building. My business is there. We've been there for this long, we're part of the community, etc. Or my family has lived in this home, or this building has such a wonderful architectural history, it needs to be preserved. Customize the letter, common messages, but each one is unique, and that makes them stand out. When you are, well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, again, on the local level, first thing I'm going to say is, I think something that Tom said earlier in terms of trying to, I think it's important to try to have some kind of a relationship with all of these people. And so one of the things that I always try to do when I meet somebody is find something that I can agree with them on. And, you know, to try to, especially in my case, in this group, where they know that I'm usually, you know, in the minority vote. And I'm trying to bring them around. So I'm starting with a position of where I'm trying to get them to put away their preconceived notions about where I'm coming from and say, hey, maybe this guy's a reasonable guy. So I try to do that. I try to look for a way, if they have some sort of an issue that they're trying to get through in the meeting, and if it's something that most of the time the standard would be, can I tolerate this, not do I support it? So if I can help them, if I can lend some support to it, you know, they begin to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe this guy isn't such a bad guy after all, maybe he's reasonable, etc. So it's sort of takes them back a little bit, I think, in terms of what their perceptions are before they come into the room. But one thing that I think is very important in the role that I'm usually in is you got to show that you have credibility. You have to speak the truth. You have to bring some knowledge to the table. You have to know what you're talking about. And you can't be just speaking rhetoric. You have to bring up facts and data. And as we've heard at this conference, we have tons of that information on our side. The challenge is, you know, how do you get it across in a way that people respond to it and don't just dismiss it? And the last thing I would say, and this is something that I practice all the time, is pick your shot. You know, if you're in a position like myself where you're going against the tide so much of the time, you know, what you have to say is going to get tuned out by everybody if you're whining and complaining about every single thing. And so try to, you know, think about, as somebody else has said, you got to think way in advance of where something is going. So how do you start laying some groundwork early and pick your shots on when you're going to stand up and push back on something. And don't be afraid to do that either, by the way. It's amazing how, again, I think probably more so at local politics, you know, because it seems like the lemmings are all heading in that direction, nobody thinks that we have a need to talk about it at all. So there's the usual rhetoric, and they're ready to go to the vote, and it's like, hey, time out, put my card up and make a comment that is, I know where the vote's going to go. I know I'm not going to change the vote, but get on the record of some data, some information, an argument against something that the people in the room aren't thinking about. And believe me, even though it's the old sometimes you got to lose the battle to try to win the war, and sometimes you got to win a battle so that you can eventually win the war. So picking your shots, I think, is very important.
Let me add something. I was listening and thinking about my own experience, and the closest I ever came to being in the position of the people on the other side of the table, I think is useful here. I was appointed by the governor of Maryland to be on the inter-county connector road commission that had to decide on whether or not to build this road. This road is basically a piece of the old Beltway in the Washington metropolitan area. The right-of-way had been set aside for like 40 years, literally 40 years. And so it became a lovely park, and now they actually wanted to pour some concrete in it. And I sat on the board, and the governor was pretty cool. He said, we're going to go get national experts rather than local politicians. And then he had local politicians added to the group. And I found it one of the most unpleasant experiences of my entire professional career. Basically, I found that I was not, in fact, the object of the people who spoke. They weren't coming to edify me or to change my mind or to correct me. Mostly they were there to insult me. They were telling me I was a tool of the moneyed interests, and I've been trying to sell out to the moneyed interests for 30 years and I can't find them. Somebody know where they are, give me the address. Anyway, what it was, and this is my perception, but I think I'm criticizing a lot of the people in this room, what I found was this guy was there taking shots at that guy from the last meeting they were at. Right. And it was like bang, 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 and it had nothing to do with the people sitting on the board. They were all getting shots in, getting even with each other from the last meeting and the meeting before, and so everybody comes in to rehearse their old standard routines and shoot back and forth, and they all go home feeling better. I used to go out and I'd call my wife and she'd say, why are you calling me? You never call me. I said, I can't stand it in there. I mean, it's the most unpleasant experience. And I have to tell you, the conclusion was we ended up with a road, not because of Paris Glendenning, who walked away from it, but the subsequent secretary used our material. By the way, the new head of WMATA was our chief technical guy on the project and did a great job. But the thing I think that was most effective, Tom Dean, head of the Transportation Research Board, was the chair of the session, and the advocates came in, the bicyclists and the transit people, and they insisted we didn't need the road, we would do this and this and this. And Tom turned to Paul Wiedefeld and said, go do the analyses. And he said, give them everything they want. And Paul came back and said, we've done it, and this is what we ran, all the transit proposals, all the bicycling proposals, and we solved 15% of the problem. And Tom turned to the audience and the board and the governor and said, what would you like to do with the other 85%? And they built the road. And I think that kind of an approach, a very sound approach, I think was what actually got that road finally built after 40 years.
Okay, so
I'm going to have to leave in about 10 minutes, so I will make some last comments if no one else minds, and I really don't care what your answer is. If you can, see if you can get appointed to some of these advisory committees, or maybe even to the Transit Board. These are one of the two main models that, besides these being elected officials that are seconded, is that people are nominated by city councils or mayors and serve on the transit board. Even if it's an advisory committee, go there, be active, try to get the most powerful position. Now let me explain. How many people think the most powerful position is chair? You're wrong. It's recording secretary. He or she that keeps the notes rules the world. And if staff is taking the first draft, make sure they know that they will get it to you and you will make the final necessary adjustments. This is what happens, by the way, whenever you have a public hearing, which those of us who have been on the other side usually refer to as open mic night at WMATA or whatever. And some of the people you get there are beyond crazy.
Participating the public.
Yes. And it's often becomes very difficult to distinguish between those that literally are crazy but have a right to speak and those that have carefully researched this, have a PhD, and are presenting the results of years of experience. So do what you can. Now, we have been asked about the Delphi technique, which is frequently used. First of all, what is now commonly called the Delphi technique is not. This was something that was developed by Rand Corporation about 50 years ago for a somewhat different purpose and has worked effectively for that purpose. We now have something that is a totally bastardized version of that no one from Rand would, you'd insult them if you said this was a Delphi technique. Yeah. And it is very, very directed. So we don't have time to go into great detail, but there are great things you can do to absolutely blow the whole meeting. You need to have a number of people. You need to practice and organize in advance. You need to come in separately. All the crazy little tricks, like they will have the meeting ahead of time to go through the script to see who do it. Sneak in. Pretend you're one of the group. Get the script if you can. Very often they've got so many groups from so many different places, they don't know who it should be there and who isn't. Don't lie, but you don't have to volunteer. You need to be able to get up and not just have one person get up and say, well, wait a minute, that sounds a little crazy. How are we supposed to distribute all these red dots and blue dots and green dots on how much we prefer light rail or bus? We don't know anything about this. What are the costs? What are the benefits? What aerial? You know, and you do it the first time, the facilitator, who is there to make sure that you're treated very politely and condescendingly and will not give you any help at all and say, we'll be getting to that. We're doing this first, but we will definitely get to that. And you're done. And that's where your friend needs to get up from the other part of the room and says, wait a minute, no, I think he has a good point here. Why don't we do this? And
about 1 minute, Tom.
two or three times, and you have effect. And then when you go into the breakout rooms, don't let the facilitator keep notes. Elect the secretary and keep your own notes and make sure what you do and what you say and what you think is actually reported and will be in the record. And then go to the meeting where the results are there and get up and say, I don't know what meeting they're reporting on, but it certainly wasn't any of the meetings I went to. Have fun. See you next year, if not before. Thanks. Bye.
All right, and let's give all the panelists a hand at this point in time because I want to go ahead and get into the general meeting. These two folks, in addition to Tom, but he's leaving, so these two guys are a wealth of information, and I would encourage you to speak with them if you have any questions. We'll take one question. How about that? Go ahead for it.
Thanks again for all your comments. Thanks for being here. A couple quick comments, and then I'll ask my question. As our congressman, as I mentioned, we're not really on policy speaking terms. He's a nice guy, but we're focusing on getting somebody else in. So when you're in that situation, what can you do? My own experience, I'm a little bit confused about what we should do, because some people said, go in there, call them on things, embarrass them, and so forth. And my motto is, and I don't mean this to be nasty, it's going to sound a little nasty, but it works, which is deflate, demoralize, defeat, rinse, and repeat. It works. And you said, Dick, that they'll just clam up. And that's where I'm a little bit confused if you're always on their case. But I find that works. It demoralizes them. It deflates them. And now recently, and I've talked to some people here at this conference, 2 people who said they've encountered the same thing we've encountered lately, and this is my question, where they simply don't respond. So as an example, specific example, our transit director, I found where he in an interview, audio interview, had said that their new plan after Greenlight to Pinellas was defeated was sort of an interim plan, and that light rail would probably come on the ballot again. And I went before the board and said, see, this is why we're suspicious of you. It seems you're going to want to have a vote again, and this plan is not really your real plan. And they had then just quietly taken down this off of YouTube, and they just give you a thank you for your input. So more and more, we're just getting silence.
So I think just a quick answer, then I'll let these guys go. It depends on the situation. I mean, obviously, if you're meeting with someone in their office, you're not going to say, hey, bozo, I really hate you. That's not going to get you particularly far. On the other hand, if you're in a public setting and you can read the situation so that making a scene, for lack of a better word, is going to get you something, then you should do it. I mean,
My question is very local. I know you were a staff. And I'm wondering, like, what does it mean when they give you silence? Because we're getting more and more of that. There's no response.
means they don't want to talk to you.
Well, first thing I would say is good cop, bad cop. You know, there's a time for the bad cop, and I like the good cop role myself. But sometimes, you know, you got to have somebody that's in your group that's going to do exactly what you said. Go do that, and you know, rinse and repeat. And if somebody is just so in their camp that you know you're never going to influence them, spend your time with somebody else. Is what I would say too. Maybe it's their opponent in the next election. You know, find somebody that doesn't like the guy either and join forces with them. And maybe that's where you'll find the bad cop and you can continue. I like to try to stay on the high road as much as possible. That's my own personal style. I've found success with that. But believe me, there is a role for people like, you know, what you were saying.
I guess I can't really expand on that very much. It does depend on the situation very much, and it depends on the level you're operating at, whether it's local community and whatever. I wasn't representing the U.S., the United Nations, and I'd get up and I'd say, well, I think what we ought to do is this and this and this. And the chairman would say, thank you for your intervention. And then they'd go on and do whatever they were doing. Yeah. And you want to say, hey, what about, you know,
right.
That was not part of the process, you know.
Okay, well, let's thank our folks one more time.